Okay, well, thank you all for joining us. There's definitely a lot happening in the world of cannabis policy and a lot of um, misinformation, a lot of confusion about what just happened. I know I've been fielding texts and emails and phone calls. And so we thought, after sort of seeing a series of some of the same questions that we would host this webinar just to kind of set the stage for actually what's happening and what folks can expect. We're actually going to have a fact sheet up tomorrow for folks, so we'll have a lot of this information that you can use in your advocacy and use with conversations with other folks. So feel free to take screenshots. We'll also be putting this video up on YouTube for you to use as well. This is a fun picture of Nixon, but I think from some of the media coverage, it seems like the war is over and now cannabis is about to be available for everyone. So let's just dive in and talk about what's happening. So first of all, I want to say my name is Steph Shear. I'm the founder and president of Americans for Safe Access. We are a nonprofit that was founded in 2002, and we're advocating for safe and legal access to cannabis for therapeutic use and research. And within the work that we do, I think it's important to say that what we're working towards is creating a world where patients only have to consider their medication in the context of their healthcare journey and not when making basic life decisions. So this means that all the work that we're doing is that we're advocating for a regulatory framework that is going to invest in the development of standardized cannabis-based products. It ensures a safe and consistent supply to those products, that fosters more medical professionals integrating cannabis into their patients' treatment plans as frontline medications, encourages insurance coverage, and prohibits employment, housing, parental, and healthcare discrimination. I also want to say we just finished an educational series in August, and one of the presentations we did was actually a deep dive into the past, present, future of cannabis scheduling. And so for the context of this webinar, I'm really going to try to focus on what's happening right now. But that webinar is free for you to watch. You can find it on our YouTube page. So what's going on right now is last week on the 29th of August, there was a leak that came from Bloomberg that HHS had sent a letter to the DEA as a part of a scheduling review. And in that letter that they actually had recommended that cannabis be moved from Schedule 1 to Schedule 2. And HHS's findings are based on a review that FDA did. And this was in response to President Biden made an announcement in October. And part of that announcement was that he requested that HHS and Department of Justice revisit the scheduling of cannabis under the Controlled Substance Act. So the thing I just want to say is that what the main thing that these findings show is they underscore that it is time for congressional action on medical cannabis. That actually this is, in a way, it unlocks a door, but there still is going to have to be action to open that door for this, for the change in the schedule of cannabis to mean something for patients. But we're still a little ways from that happening. So let me just start with the facts. What just happened? So let me be clear. I have not seen the letter. That I'm sure was part of a report that went to DEA. In fact, right now, the only people we know for certain have seen it are folks at FDA, HHS, DEA, and probably Department of Justice. The public, including Congress, will only see the HHS findings if and when one of the following happens. If there's a successful FOIA filing, and that means it's a Freedom of Information Act, if somebody tries to get that document. It seems like there has actually been a couple of attempts, but because it's a process document, it's unlikely that would be granted unless there's a long delay. Last time there was a rescheduling process was actually a leak of the document, so that could happen. There could be some type of congressional or Senate committee that compels the findings. And this would probably only happen if there's a really long delay at Department of Justice. But definitely when we will see it is when the Department of Justice makes their final determination on the scheduling. I also want to say that as I'm speaking, if you have questions, you can add them to either the Q&A or the chat. I'm going to pause in a couple places where it might be appropriate to take questions, but I'm going to try to get through this presentation so we can leave as much time for questions as possible. So what's different about this rescheduling process is the other 5 rescheduling processes that you've probably heard about were actually initiated by a petition. And that meant that FDA, HHS, DEA, DOJ were actually responding to the content of a petition. And so they were actually reacting to that. In this case, the instruction for this review came from the President of the United States. And so what was also different about this is that Biden didn't ask FDA or DEA to look at whether or not cannabis had medical value. What they asked is like, does cannabis belong in Schedule 1? And that is important for a lot of reasons. But what is also interesting about there not being a petition is there's actually a little bit of wiggle room for FDA and HHS, DEA and DOJ to look at this process in sort of a larger context instead of just trying to either confirm or disprove the findings of a petition. So this is in the longer scheduling webinar that I was talking about. But the 5 rescheduling petitions go back all the way to 1972. The first one, it actually went from 1972 to 1989 before there was a response. There were lawsuits. There was a second one filed in 1995. More lawsuits. Americans for Safe Access actually became part of one in 2002. More lawsuits. And the one that the most recent denial actually came from a petition that was filed by the governors of Rhode Island and Washington State. And that denial came in 2016. And again, all this information you can find on our website, but also in that longer historical account of scheduling. So after the 2016 denial, one thing that actually came out of that process was that the DEA actually went against some of the information that they had in their own documents, and Americans for Safe Access actually sued the DEA using their own data, saying that they were disseminating information about gateway theory and a few other items like psychosis that in their own findings they said were not true. And so one of the reasons we don't hear politicians or the DEA talking about things like the gateway theory as much is, or hardly ever, is because of our successful Information Quality Act petition. Sorry, it used to be called the Data Quality Act. Now it's called the Information Quality Act. So what what FDA under HHS and then DEA under Department of Justice are required to do in their analysis of scheduling under the Controlled Substance Act is they have to do what's called an 8-factor analysis. And this means they have to look at the actual or relative potential for abuse, scientific evidence of its pharmacological effects, if it's known, the state of current scientific knowledge, the history and current pattern of abuse. I think you're seeing a pattern here, the scope and duration and significance of abuse, what, if any, risk there is to public health, its psychic or psychological dependence liability, and whether the substance is an immediate precursor of a substance that's already controlled. So this is a process that both FDA and DEA will be gathering scientific information to make this decision. They also, and this was actually something that was added in a rescheduling process for cannabis and now is applied to other substances that do not have a new drug application. And this is a 5-element test for determining whether or not, and this is very specific, a drug has currently accepted medical use in the treatment in the United States. And so under that criteria, they're looking at if the drug's chemistry is known and reproducible, that there are adequate safety studies, that there are adequate and well-controlled studies proving efficacy, that the drug is accepted by qualified experts, and that the scientific evidence is widely available. And if you want to see sort of what happened in 2016, we've created this little fact sheet for folks where we broke down what was in the DEA's finding, and you can actually find it here on our website, or just go to safeaccessnow.org/blog, and it's actually it's in the blog with Nixon's picture on it. And so if you want to really do a deep dive to see what it is that that the DEA and HHS said in 2016, to kind of, if you're looking at a crystal ball, this will give you some indication of at least what they were looking at in the past. All right, so other things that we do, like with the facts for what's happening, is that the DEA is now performing their own review. And so this is going to include the HHS findings and recommendations. Then they're going to do their own sort of analysis of the 8-factor analysis and the currently accepted medical use, all of those items. And they're also going to factor in the impact of scheduling on international drug treaties. There's not a time requirement for this. So, if you noticed in some of the past sort of timeline I showed you, some of those took 20 years, some of them, took at least 5 years. The last one, actually, HHS made their recommendation in 2015. About 18 months later, we saw a response from DEA. So, there's obviously a lot of eyes on this and a lot of pressure. So, I don't see it taking that long. But just if you're wondering, like, is there some way to compel them? That there's actually no time limit on this response. So, what we also know is that under the definition of schedules, in order for HHS to have made the recommendation of Schedule 3, and again, this is without seeing their report, what we can assume is that they came to the conclusion that cannabis has accepted medical use in the United States, and that cannabis has a moderate to low potential for physical and psychological dependence. And this is coming from the definition of Schedule 3. Schedule 3 drugs abuse potential is less than 1 or 2, but more than 4. So that's from the DEA's website. So we know that within their finding, in order to make a recommendation for Schedule 3, they had to make those findings. So again, we don't know exactly how they came to that decision, but we know that had to have happened in order for them to make a Schedule 3 recommendation. Now, HHS, I just want to be clear, in them asserting that cannabis has accepted medical use in the United States, this is not equivalent of an FDA approval or even the recognition that cannabis is a medicine under the FDA's definition, right? And I think this is going to sort of play out in policy in a pretty significant way. Now, a lot of people have said, and there's a lot of debate and legal sort of back and forth about whether or not the Department of Justice is bound to follow HHS's recommendation. From my analysis and the analysis of attorneys we've worked with, we think the Department of Justice can actually, they do not have to go by what HHS has said. However, because of the following, I do not see the Department of Justice keeping cannabis in Schedule 1. The biggest one is basically sort of the guidelines that the Biden administration put before them, basically saying it doesn't belong there. But if you look at the 2016 petition and past petitions, as far as the accepted medical use in the United States, the Department of Justice does defer to HHS on that. And the Department of Justice is bound to the definitions in the schedules. And so Schedule 1 drugs are defined as substances or chemicals that are defined as drugs with no currently accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse. So for instance, cocaine is a Schedule II substance. Methamphetamine is a Schedule II substance. And so because of that specific definition, if HHS is saying Schedule 3, I just don't see a scenario where the Department of Justice would come out with saying it has to stay in Schedule 1. I think the other factor is that the controlled substance has very strong ties to the UN single drug treaties. And this is actually some of the sort of drug warriors, which you'll also learn from that scheduling webinar. You actually needed the cover of the UN single treaty to even pass the Controlled Substance Act in the United States because of the strength of the states' rights. And so because of that tie, I think it's important to note that the UN recognized cannabis medical's use when it actually changed the schedule of cannabis in 2020. And so if the Department of Justice comes back and says they think it belongs in Schedule 1, we'll actually be in conflict we're in conflict now, but we would remain in conflict with the UN Single Drug Treaty. That in many ways was our sort of baby to create a war on drugs globally. And so, if you want more information on that process, you can find this on our website, as well as in the scheduling webinar. All right, I'm gonna sort of move to some of the impact questions, but Jeff, are there any questions on just sort of the facts, like what's going on, before I kind of start talking about the facts of what the impact is?
Yeah, there was actually a process question from Carl regarding publication of the letter in the Federal Register, or if they'll be taking public comment on it.
I don't believe so. I don't think there's a requirement for public comment. There could be public comment afterwards. They may decide to open it up for public comment, but it is not a part of the requirement for a scheduling petition.
And will it be published in the Federal Register?
It will when the DEA makes its final determination.
All right, great. I think that's the rest are mostly impact.
Great. And I know that's where a lot of the questions lie. So I first want to say, and this is a big thing, that whether cannabis is in Schedule 2 or Schedule 3, whatever happens from here, I think the impact of just knowing that HHS has made these findings, that it is going to have an impact on the attitudes about medical cannabis in general. It's going to reduce some of the stigma, and that stigma, whether it's family members, whether it's your workplace, that there's at least a recognition that there's an accepted medical use for cannabis. I think this will extend into medical professionals, employers, state regulators, and what we really need is for this to influence Congress. So this is a big deal. This is definitely a very big deal, and I think that what people are looking for is like, what are the legal implications, which we'll get into. But I also just want to remind everyone that right now in the United States, the only protections for the cannabis programs we see at the state level are actually from an amendment to the budget of the Department of Justice, people often refer to as a CJS amendment, that prohibits the DEA and Department of Justice from enforcing the laws around Schedule I substances in states that have medical cannabis programs. And so obviously there's nothing protecting the adult use programs. And so, the combination of public support, public will are kind of holding this in place. So when I talk about attitudes and the sort of, the sentiment around this, it's really just the sentiment around cannabis that is keeping people out of prison and allowing these state programs to move forward, especially on the adult use side. Okay, so there's a lot of a lot of focus, especially on the cannabis business side, that that if cannabis is moved, out of Schedule 3, that it will know, the people will be able to, that it'll be legal, right? And that they'll be able to um, uh, deduct business expenses. And so now, while that is true about 288, which I'll get to in a second, I think it's really important to understand that unregulated Schedule 2 and 3 substances, they're still federally illegal, right? So just because cannabis, this big bucket, in the same way that cocaine is a Schedule 2 substance, if you are producing it or selling it, that is considered trafficking. And if it's outside of a regulatory process, it still has major penalties, which I have here. And so this is for Schedule 3 for any amount. If you're cultivating, manufacturing, or distributing these Schedule 3 substances, they're still 10-year, second offense, 20-year, and these large fines. So we still need Congress to do something. Luckily, the federal government actually doesn't charge simple possession very often. But again, this by scheduling it, what we have is a key, but we haven't opened the door. So 280E specifically refers to Schedule 1 and Schedule 2 substances. So if you're not a part of the cannabis businesses, you may have seen this and wondered what folks are talking about. There is a statute on tax code 280E that specifically says if you're distributing, manufacturing, or selling a Schedule 1 or 2 substance, that you cannot deduct business expenses. And so and I think a lot of this is to sort of raise the stock prices for cannabis businesses, that folks are like, this is, as soon as it becomes a Schedule 3, then, all of a sudden these businesses will be able to deduct their taxes. And I wish that were true. But in the United States, all income is taxable. So I'm sure you all have heard about Al Capone going down for not paying taxes. So whether you're doing something legally or illegally, if you're making an income, you're supposed to pay taxes. But businesses that are not legal, they are not allowed to deduct business expenses. So think about like racketeering, illegal sports betting, prostitution, cockfights, dog fights, right? Like these things you're not allowed to deduct these business expenses for. And this is, going to be true until there is a federal pathway for these businesses to legally operate. And that's going to take Congress. And Congress could say the states are in control of that. They could pass legislation that we would like to see, where there's actually an agency that oversees that. But something in Congress is going to have to happen, for that to change. Arguably, if there is a Schedule, if it goes to Schedule 3, there are businesses that are currently cultivating cannabis for research. I think there's about 8 of them that might affect those businesses. Again, if it's Schedule 3. And I think this is another important part in this, whether you're talking about rescheduling or even descheduling, right now, the FDA actually defers to DEA when it comes to enforcement of any laws around a Schedule 1 substance, right? But as soon as a substance moves out of Schedule 1, then it's subject to the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act that allows FDA enforcement authority. And so this is for anything that's intended for human consumption. And so if you look at like CBD, for example, FDA, when it was still at the state level, they weren't weighing in. But after the Farm Bill, you started seeing FDA weighing in and starting to try to enforce the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. Now, obviously, around the Farm Bill, there's some discussion about what the FDA can actually do and whether or not the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act is going to work to allow them to create regulations. And again, this is why we want to see an office that's dedicated to creating these regulations. But again, as soon as cannabis moves out of Schedule 1, it is then subject to other laws. And I just use the FDA as one example. Before I jump into sort of the unknown, any questions there, or should I just go ahead and get to the unknown part first, Jeff, and then get to the questions?
I think keep going because
Right.
we'll have a whole bunch at the end.
Okay, sounds great. All right, so what I want to be clear is there's a lot of unknowns, and like as I mentioned, right now, if if the office of the president, if the executive branch decided that it did not want to see cannabis being sold or distributed in the United States, they could close down those businesses. They could send cease and desist orders, because of the public support that would make someone unpopular. But I think we can't underestimate what will happen if we lose public support. So people focus a lot on the business news of the money that's being generated. There's also a lot of stories of people going to kids going to hospitals, of cannabis consumers having heavy metals in their system. And at any point, if if the harm starts to outweigh the benefit for the public, and that public support goes away, then all it would take would be, literally a signature of the president to say, okay, no more. And this would be the same, the truth around FDA enforcement, right? If cannabis is moved into Schedule 2 or 3, if the executive branch decides, like, okay, the only cannabis that will be allowed will be under a prescription medication, which we know that there is not one that would be available, then that could shut down the program. But again, this is why we have to sort of pay attention to the whole conversation. And so without Congress doing something, there really is not a legal framework protecting these businesses, except for medical cannabis businesses, are protected under the CJS amendment. Again, some of the other unknown, and there's actually all sorts of test case of this, of the public, deciding that they're against something. And in fact, in cannabis's history, in the 70s, it was basically becoming decriminalized, and there were parents groups that were tired of seeing cartoon characters on bongs being sold near their children, and started making some noise that actually built a movement to make it more restricted than ever. So I think that things like product safety protocols, regulations, really seeing good research happening, that is going to continue to foster public support is key, unless we change federal laws. Something that I think a lot of people really overlooked, the Medical Marijuana and Cannabidiol Research Expansion Act that was signed by President Biden last year. It was actually something that ASA helped author and introduce in 2016. And while many of the actions that are in that bill, we were able to get through administrative actions, it did some major things. One thing, which I think a lot of people don't talk about very much, is it actually solidified the rights of doctors to talk to their patients about medical cannabis and other cannabinoids, which until this act was passed, that protection was actually just codified under the First Amendment right through a lawsuit called Conant versus McCaffrey. But another thing that this bill did is in Section 401, and it titled Federal Research, actually called on HHS and NIH to come back with this report within a year, which would be in December, telling these various committees, what is needed as far as research, as far as regulations, as far as creating a pathway for these products. So, this is actually something that we're working on getting, some comments and advice to HHS and NIH in the same way we did for the FDA, in the same way we will be doing for the DEA. But this could, this could actually set a guideline, and what I'm hoping is it will actually call for something that looks very similar to the legislation that we have been calling for. And so again, this is sort of a crystal ball that really depends on the executive branch, but if Schedule 2 through 5, right now the states are actually acting outside of the Controlled Substance Act anyway. So the day-to-day sort of function in those states would not change unless we started seeing FDA enforcing their authority, or if that made a change within the enforcement at the Department of Justice level. A lot of the regulations that we see for regulated Schedule 3, Schedule 2 substances, they don't match up with with the marketplace that we see right now. And what we do know is that descheduling is it's not going to happen through this request. And again, whether you're talking about Schedule 2, 5 descheduling, or a new schedule, this is all going to require some specialized regulatory oversight if we're going to see an end between state and federal conflict. And I think, from our perspective and for our constituents, if we're going to see a pathway for cannabis and cannabinoid medicines to move forward. Okay, is that a good space, or should I just go ahead and finish it? Jeff, what do you think?
Why don't you go ahead and finish it off?
Okay.
We've got plenty of questions, so I think we'll
okay, sounds good. All right. So when Congress is looking at, they actually have all the controls over the Controlled Substance Act. I was actually writing a presentation the other day, and I was thinking of the line from Coming to America, where the king's wife said, "I thought you were the king as far as making up rules." And if Congress tells you that they have no power when it comes to the Controlled Substance Act, the reality is they're the ones who made the Controlled Substance Act. They're the ones who enacted the law, and they're the ones who can change it. So, after Biden made his request, the Congressional Research Service was asked by a member of Congress what Congress can do, and the CRS came back and said that they could, amend the CSA, and they can do this outside of the process that's happening right now. They could, create a new schedule, which is something that we have been advocating for, or they can remove it from the CSA altogether. And so, these are all options that Congress are still in front of them, whether or not this process is happening within the executive branch. What we would like to see is a cannabis and cannabinoid medicine initiative. We want to see actually pathways created that wouldn't just expand what we're seeing at the state levels that's called medical cannabis, because in fact, those programs are really compassionate use programs. What we would like to see is, cannabis products make their way into healthcare industries, make their way, into a process. And right now, under the pathways for drug development, that doesn't exist. And so we have created this legislative proposal that would actually, create that pathway. And you can download this, and there's actually, we have webinars on this as well, of course, but you can see the full text of the legislation, some fact sheets, and even a presentation on this legislation at safeaccessnow.org, Safe Access for All. And I think for us, what we're nervous about, and the reason we want to create this pathway, is that without creating a pathway for cannabis medicines, what we'll likely see for cannabis regulations in its own sweet time is, regulations created for an intoxicant market, and maybe regulations created for a dietary supplement market. And what that would mean would be that it would be unlikely that there would be standardized evidence-based products brought to market, that doctors would learn and utilize cannabis treatments, that insurance providers would cover these medications, and that patients would be free of discrimination and stigma. So, again, we are very grateful to the businesses that have created, have been providing access in this sort of compassionate use model. But if we're going to, ultimately get the protections that we need and create safe access for everyone, not just privileged Americans, we're going to have to move cannabis, the commodity, into the healthcare industries. And so, I just want to be clear that right now, not a lot of people are talking to Congress about medical cannabis or about anything really, except for, the sort of cannabis businesses focusing on taxation and banking. And so we know that from, the elections in 2022, that very few members of Congress or people running for congressional seats even mentioned cannabis at all. So this is a big change from when we were able to pass the CJS amendment. So in order for us to actually create this pathway, people are going to have to start talking to their members of Congress again. They're going to have to start making noise when they're home, writing letters to the editor, going to town halls, etc. And, I want to reiterate that as advocates, your voice matters, that actually members of Congress and their staff actually will put more weight in what a constituent says than a visit from a lobbyist. The challenge is that if there's not a constituent there for them to talk to or to get their opinion from, and there's a lobbyist there, they're probably going to listen to that lobbyist. So, there's a few things working against us that a lot of people think we've already won. People don't understand the impact that advocates have had. And there's limited resources now for advocacy. A lot of the sort of social change, social impact donors who originally funded this work, see the $25 billion, $40 billion cannabis industry headlines, and feel like that's where the funding for this work should come. So again, looking at a federal medical cannabis program, what we're seeing is that we want to see a new office, an Office of Medical Cannabis and Cannabinoid Control under the Department of Health and Human Services, not under FDA, not a center under FDA, but actually an office that has authority, a creation of a new schedule, Schedule 6, which is what we've seen happen in other countries. And this would be overseen by the Office of Medical Cannabis and Cannabinoid Control, not DEA. This would coordinate with state regulators. It wouldn't interrupt the current access or supply chain, but it would build on that. I think it would actually work with all of the federal agencies to provide guidance and coordination with expertise, cannabis expertise, which right now all of these agencies are trying to figure this out, but they don't necessarily have the leadership of people who have worked in cannabis. And this agency would be able to foster private-public partnerships for research and product development. So again, this is sort of what that looks like. You can find the legislative text on the website. And for Schedule 6, again, people are like, well, what is Schedule 6? Well, it's we would be making it up. And one of the reasons that we would like to see Schedule 6 is that creating a subcategory of any of the existing schedules would include a lot of criminal penalties that exist for unregulated scheduled products. And we think this would create a pathway for product development, for us to build on the state programs, and for us to learn more about cannabis products. And so again, I think I say, like, if you want to see and participate and impact the outcome of what's going to happen next, you have to get involved. If you go to safeaccessnow.org, Safe Access for All, we have a legislative toolkit, we have actions you can take, we have outreach toolkits, but it's really going to take all of us if we're going to want to see whatever happens from this rescheduling process actually turn into action. And again, if cannabis is just rescheduled and there isn't a congressional action, you know, it may be a very long time before we see anything happen from Congress. So I think we got to hit while the iron's hot, so to speak. And so, again, we're Americans for Safe Access. You could become a member. You can become a sponsor to support this work. And again, if you want to really a deep dive into the cannabis scheduling, past, present, and future, there will be more information than you ever thought you would ever need to know if you want to watch that webinar. And that's actually part of a whole series that we did this summer that includes more of a deep dive into the National Medical Cannabis Program, what's happening to patients in adult use markets, and really looking at product safety in all of the different cannabis markets. So with that in mind, Jeff, do we have some questions?
We do. We have some really interesting ones. Let's get started. We've talked a lot about the federal state conflict, and we had a question about if a change to Schedule 3 would mean less federal interference, or if it would have an impact on the sort of barriers that patients have from the Fed.
So it would really, I think it would not just by itself, I guess is the fastest way to say that. I think it would create, a lot of things that we talk about, like interstate commerce would still not be allowed. The ability to travel with cannabis would still not be allowed unless Congress specifically authorizes that to happen. Like everything, there's always decisions about enforcement, but we do know about the war on drugs overall, is that a lot of those sort of decisions about enforcement fall on the poor and on minorities. And so that's definitely not something I would just want to live with. But there's not an automatic one. Now after it's rescheduled, HUD could come out and say, okay, we're going to allow patients to use cannabis in subsidized housing. It could, I think, where we will see a lot of things open up is, I think it'll make it easier. Again, if it's Schedule 3, it'll be easier for people to get research licenses to cultivate. So this could really beef up like the Veterans Administration if they wanted to start cultivating cannabis and producing products and involve more veterans directly in research protocols. That's a possibility. Under the Opioid Disorder Act, I believe that's the name of it, that was passed last year by Congress. There were all of these things sort of that were added for treatment. So one of them is that a physician can directly administer a Schedule 3 substance to a patient to help them with detox. Could it be possible that becomes a research study in one of these opioid centers, where they're directly administering cannabis to those patients in a research setting? I think we'll see there's a lot of opportunity there. But again, there would have to be investment in that happening. And what we're seeing internationally, and I think this is especially important in the United States, is that we're not seeing pharmaceutical companies jump in and try to create these products. And part of the reason is around the IP around what can be patented, and most of the research that we're seeing around efficacy is happening outside of the United States, and it's happening in either funded by countries that have state-funded insurance, and so they're looking for ways to lower their the burden of that insurance cost, and so they're looking at ways to utilize cannabis in treatment that would be cheaper than other drugs. And then we're also seeing generic distributors are paying for efficacy. So, again, in Europe and other places, the medications are actually driven a little differently in that, pharmacists, most pharmacists in Europe are compounding pharmacists. And so they can, get a prescription from a doctor, to make a cannabis product that is a pill or a tincture, or in a flower form that they could vaporize, and the pharmacist can actually prepare that there. It's not a specific brand. It's more based on the compounds, and that happens with a lot of medications in other countries. And in the United States, our medical program is really company and brand driven. And so, like, whoever's the first to market, only, the pharmacist can just count those pills. They can't recreate them until it goes to generic. I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, I think a lot of these are gonna talk about how this change of schedule working sort of as a catalyst more than a changing all that stuff itself. If assuming it moves to a Schedule 3, how would that impact pharmacies? Would patients be able to go to a pharmacy and get some cannabis?
Only if pharmacies. Well, two things. There's two sides of that coin. One is that there has to be a product that is a registered Schedule 3 product that a pharmacy wants to provide, and there has to be a licensing process for that pharmacy to provide it. So right now, again, because there isn't a regulatory system for whole plant cannabis, and I think what a lot of people are thinking is, as soon as it's Schedule 3, then researchers can just start researching all the cannabis that's at the state level and start putting that through efficacy studies. And that just isn't the case. There has to be a process for that cannabis to prove its safety and efficacy, and more importantly, its reproducibility, right? And so if you think about a clinical trial, one of the big challenges we have with cannabis clinical trials is actually, part of it is because of the restrictions, but another part of it is actually, products to put into a clinical trial. If if a batch of cannabis or whatever product you're using in a clinical trial changes from batch to batch, or you run out of it, or there's a change in cannabinoid or terpene levels, then that is going to alter the outcome of the clinical trial. And so, what we're looking at, in our work in the medical cannabis and cannabinoid, or sorry, the Cannabis and Cannabinoid Medicine Initiative, is actually, creating the tools and regulatory recommendations for companies to be able to do that. So the answer is, it opens the door, but currently whole plant products cannot make it through FDA approval because they were designed for single compound substances. So what we need is for HHS, again, to create what we think is an Office of Medical Cannabis and Cannabinoid Control that would create that pathway. And so if you see, like, under this structure, there's a subdivision of medical cannabis and health and science, a subdivision of medical cannabis, agriculture and cultivation, subdivision of state and local control. And so, if you are really interested in how we see this sort of building that pathway, and you enjoy looking at legislation, I would say go, take a stab at it. There's also the fact sheets help explain it. And there's also a presentation that does sort of a deep dive into that. But the answer is like, it makes it maybe more people interested in creating those pathways, but there still has to be guidance for that to happen. And again, I told you at the beginning, like, you're probably not going to be very excited about these answers because of, again, sort of what we've been dealing with for over 20 years at Americans for Safe Access is it's going to take an act of Congress to move us out of this this sort of paradigm, even if cannabis is scheduled in a way that recognizes its medical use.
Speaking of our legislation, You touched on the criminal penalties for Schedule 3. Could you compare those with the Schedule 6?
So what is fun with creating your own schedule is that there would be no federal penalties, criminal penalties. There would be would be more around fraud, around creating fake products, fake labels, creating and marketing products that that don't have uh, uh, the contents that they say that they have, or making claims that they don't have. And so those are all civil fines. They're not criminal penalties, unless you get to like a giant scary racketeering thing. But again, those would not be enforced under the Controlled Substance Act. Those would be enforced under other federal statutes.
Great. We see a sort of uh, ripple from federal scheduling down to state level. How would you see that playing out for a change of cannabis schedule?
So there are many states that actually have a policy that as soon as a substance is rescheduled, like a prescription drug, at the federal level, it automatically is changes schedule at the state level, and the same is true if it goes up. So there have been cases where pain medications automatically go up. However, there's not been an instance of something going from a Schedule 1 to a new schedule. And so I'm unclear if that automatic thing is going to happen, and it's in less than half the states. So every state has its own scheduling process. In the 80s, when Robert Randall helped create the investigative new drug program for cannabis, another part of the work that he helped do is actually create these programs, and I believe it was in 30 states that it ended up passing these laws, where the states actually acted as a distributor for the IND program. So the states actually would pass these laws, and they would actually order cannabis for the patients in their states. And actually New Mexico was the first one. And if you're interested in that history, look up Robert Randall, Alice O'Leary. They like to say it didn't all start in California. But part of that legislation included in some of the cases that when cannabis is rescheduled at the federal level, that it would be changed at the state level. Finding that statute, all of those laws happened between I think 78 was the first law, and then I think the IND shut down under Bush Senior in the 80s, and so some of that state statute just got overwritten by the state program. So I'm sorry, I know somebody's like, she's going to give a really clear, just easy answer soon, but unfortunately, nothing in cannabis policy is that direct.
Well, I'm sure they appreciate our trying.
I wish I could just say like HHS said that they want it to be Schedule 3, and we were done. Trust me, nobody wishes that more than me and the members of Americans for Safe Access.
How do you see a change of schedule impacting cannabis research?
So I've mentioned a little bit of that. I think there's actually you may have heard talk of this, that there's actually a DEA license for Schedule 1 substances for to cultivate them and for research purposes. Actually, this was something that we were able to successfully lobby the Obama administration, and then the Trump and Biden, to actually open up this monopoly on DEA licenses, for cultivating marijuana for research. So if it's Schedule 2, it's still pretty restrictive. And so, for decades, there was only one supplier. Now there's 8 supplier for research. If it's moved to Schedule 3, there's a sort of a less expensive process for researchers. And so like right now, in order to utilize cannabis in a clinical trial or research study, the security and the security requirements, just for the location, like the safe that you have to purchase to be able to store the cannabis when it's not being used in the study, it's so expensive. I mean, it's more intense than plutonium. And so that definitely, if a researcher at a university doesn't have access to the security protocols, then they can't research cannabis. So I think that, that's where we're going to see, a big opening, is actually more flexibility in just the sort of basics of being able to procure cannabis for research. Again, it would have to be through one of these research licenses, but I would love to see that open up, and hopefully with public-private partnerships, with an initiative like the Office of Medical Cannabis and Cannabinoid Control. You could really see, instead of just having $1 million doing an observational study on one part of cannabis, that we could actually create a research priority map and actually start producing research that would result in formulations for products for patients.
Great. Looks like we're getting close to 9, but I think we've got time for one more question. I'm really interested in it too. So obviously this is all happening in a political context. So how do you think change of scheduling plays into Biden's reelection and in Congress?
It could. I would say that, if it were anyone else but Biden, I might think that they were making more calculations about this. I feel like the current president is actually really bad at taking credit for things that he does. And so making the calculus of the impact, I don't know how much he's looking at that. I'm sure his advisors are. There's definitely one school of thought that, the Biden advisors were pushing this process through HHS, so that, this sort of, that part was done, and, that the Department of Justice could make their recommendations maybe at a key time along the political trail. If there's something intense happening around during the election where he needs to score some points. I don't know how much that would be coming directly from Biden, but potentially advisors or people around them. What Biden is saying, and I think this is pretty interesting, one is that, his press secretary is reiterating that this is a completely independent process, which in a way kind of takes the credit away from him. But his press secretary also said on Friday that he has always been in support of legalizing medical cannabis. So that is good news. I love the word always. That's the only part of that sentence I'm not sure about, but I'll take it, because if he is excited about the legalizing of medical cannabis, then hopefully he'll support comprehensive legislation. So I would say it's possible. I feel like any other president, I would say, was probably more calculating, would be thinking of that. But I wouldn't put it past advisors, and it could either be done as something that happens, but before the election to turn out folks, or it could be a carrot to say, that he can make sure that would happen after he's reelected. So uncertain, but definitely I think the pressure that's coming from the Senate, from Schumer, from other folks are definitely looking at that ticket as part of trying to be able to take credit for a movement in cannabis policy.
All right. I think
All right.
that's what we got.
Okay, well, I just want to remind everyone, first I want to say thank you for joining us. And if you have more questions, please send them our way. We're obviously going to be staying on top of this, and we'll be posting a fact sheet tomorrow that has a lot of this information and has references. If you want to look at the fact sheet that I mentioned about the 2016, it's on the blog that probably got you here. So just go to safeaccessnow.org/blog and click on the blog with Nixon. And you can download a fact sheet to really look and see what the Department of Justice and HHS did in 2016. And I just want to stress to you that we are a nonprofit. We are in a lot of ways, the only ones really looking at this sort of piece, looking at the outcome for patients. And if this is important to you, we need your help to continue to do this analysis and to advocate for this pathway for cannabis medicines. Thank you so much and have a great night.